And so our chapter 5 review is going to be on tissues. So I hope you folks had a chance to look at the tissues and see a good way to review is to actually, you can look at the lab notes too, because the tissues, the notes for tissues and the exercises for the lab are going to cross over in the lecture, and it's always nice to have some reinforcement out there. It makes a big difference. So that being said, let's talk about tissues for a little bit. Okay, last review, we got into chapter 4, we're talking about the cell. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take a bunch of cells and put them together, similar types of cells, and they're going to have some sort of common function. And that common function could be something like secretion, absorption, filtration, protection. All right, but now we're going to start to move up in our organizational levels. So we started small with atoms and molecules, then we moved on to cells, the smallest biological functional unit of the body. Now we're going to start to group those cells together into tissues. And so the study of tissues is called histology. From time to time, I'll refer to it as histo. It was a class that I didn't like when I took it many times, okay? But over time, I've grown to appreciate histology, and I hope that you will too. So something that, if you're going to be successful in this chapter, you need to have this memorized. You need to know off the top of your head that any professor, I don't care if it's your English professor, if they were to ask you to name the 4 tissue types, you need to be able to spit it out: epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous tissue. All right, that's going to follow you through the rest of this course, through the rest of 211 and any other courses that you take. So you need to be able to spit it out. My son can do it. I know you folks can. All right. So when we go through these different tissue types, you're going to notice that there is a lot of variety in our tissue types. And it's amazing to me that we've just scaled it down to 4 tissue types. After taking histology the first time, I felt like there were hundreds of tissue types. All right. So there's a wide variety. They're going to look very different, right? And the functions that they have are going to be quite diverse also. So we're going to talk about a lot of this stuff. So let's start off by talking about the first tissue type, which is epithelial tissue. Okay. Now, hopefully by now you had a chance to kind of go over and look into how we name epithelial tissue. But some of the characteristics that you want to know about epithelial tissue is that the cells are closely packed. I mean, very little space in between the cells. And that's going to make sense because we're going to use this type of tissue to cover a lot of our body surfaces. For example, your skin, the outer layer of your skin, your epidermis is epithelial tissue. And those cells are tightly packed. And it's what offers that water resistance too, helps to keep water from penetrating or any other type of material substance from getting underneath the skin there. We're going to see epithelial tissue lining our body cavities. We talked about that back in chapter 1 when we were learning about the serous membranes. Serous membranes are made up of epithelial tissue there. And if you were to take an embryology class, you would learn that during the formation of the fetus and the baby, that epithelial tissue is going to create the majority of the glands. And in some cases, it'll invaginate or push down underneath the surface of the skin. And one last characteristic, which is very, very important to know, is this fella right here, avascular. That means the epithelial tissue does not have a blood supply directly. So it has to rely on other means, other methods of getting nutrients and disposing of wastes. We talked a little bit about it, and I'm hopefully that you did get a chance to watch some of my other videos on chapter 4. But diffusion plays a huge role in how this type of tissue is going to get its nutrients and manage to get rid of its wastes because of its avascular nature. And again, a lot of it has to do with that avascular nature, has to do with these cells and tissues being so tightly packed, we just can't get blood vessels in there. All right, virtually no to little extracellular matrix will be found. Some other characteristics about epithelial tissue is what we call cellularity. All right, so what it basically means is that when you're describing this type of tissue, that the majority of this tissue is made up of these tightly packed cells. All right, very little extracellular matrix, which is all the material outside of the cell. As the name says, extra is outside. So we're going to be describing this tissue, we're going to base a lot of our description in the characteristics on the type of cells that are involved. Well, because some of the cells have particular structures, and that brings up the next characteristic, which is polarity. And basically, it means when we're describing a cell, all right, that we're going to have sides to the cell, we're going to have a top to the bottom of the cell. The top part of the cell is called the apical surface. And this is usually going to be exposed to the external environment, like our skin is exposed to the room that you're sitting in right now, or to an internal body space, whether it's a vessel of some sort, or if we're dealing with some of our serous membranes. And on the apical surface, that's where we can find, all right, some of the plasma membrane surface extensions or modifications. The microvilla, which is used for increased surface absorption, and the cilia, which is used for movement of stuff, things past the cell. Of course, on the sides of our cell, because we said that our cells are so tightly packed, we want to make sure that the tightness of these cells that are packed so close together, we want to make sure that things aren't shifting around and moving around, so we have these intercellular junctions. And that prevents things from moving in between the cells easily, but it also helps to keep the cells tightly packed. And then finally, the bottom portion of our cell is known as the basal surface. All right, and it's the basal surface that is going to be attached to the connective tissue below. So the top part of the cell is the apical, the bottom part of the cell is the basal. Easy to remember, B, basal, bottom. Apical apex is the top, and then the lateral is going to be the sides. So here you can see a nice little picture of our cell, and you can tell, here's the basal surface down here. Here's the, I'm sorry, that was the connective tissue. Here's the basal surface down here. Here's the apical surface up here. And then you have your lateral, the sides here, where we'll have our intracellular junctions here. And of course, keep in mind, all of epithelial tissue, the basal layer, unless it's simple, all right, because then that's all the cells, are going to contact the basement membrane right here. The basement membrane. All right, a couple things you should know about the functions of epithelial tissue is obviously physical protection. And again, I use the skin a lot when I talk about epithelial tissue. But again, that physical protection is going to protect both inside and outside surfaces. Right, so the lining of those body cavities, the lining of our body, the skin. So therefore, it does help with dehydration, right, abrasion and destruction, damage. So these are very important functions, all right, for epithelial tissue. Now, an interesting function of epithelial tissue is the next, selective permeability. Basically, it makes it the gatekeepers. Similar to the plasma membrane, how the plasma membrane is selective, it lets certain things into the cell and certain things out of the cell. All right, epithelial tissue is going to follow in suit. Okay, it's going to allow the movement or passage of certain things, items, substances, solutes, all right, across the epithelial tissue, all right, while at the same time preventing the movement of other items. Very important. All right, secretions, again, we said that this type of tissue, right, is found in a lot of glands. So therefore, it's going to be important to understand that the function of a lot of this tissue can be secretory, right? These cells are going to make something and then they're going to secrete it. And we'll see that in both our exocrine, which are glands that, all right, have ducts, D-U-C-T-S, And then our endocrine glands, those are glands that do not have ducts. And we really haven't quite talked about the nervous tissue quite as much. Obviously, we just started our tissues, all right? And you would think that sensations would be more of a nervous tissue function, but believe it or not, epithelial tissue does have a specialized epithelium. We call it neuroepithelium. And this type of epithelium plays a role with the nervous system. And so it's going to supply information, primarily sensory information, to the nervous system. Touch, pain, all right, thermal regulation, different aspects there. And so it will help, all right, with that homeostasis that we're going to see. So when we classify our epithelial tissue, we're going to classify it with using two tools. The first classification tool that we're going to use is going to be the number of cell layers. All right, so I try to make this as easy and as basic as possible. If it is one cell layer thick, right, it is simple epithelium. That means all the cells are going to contact that basement membrane. So the primary function for this type of epithelium is going to be filtration, absorption, and secretion. All right, thin epithelium is ideal for those functions. All right, so when we're also classifying the epithelium based on the number of cells, if it's more than one cell layer thick, so if it's two or more cell layers thick, then we call it stratified epithelium. And in that case, the bottommost layer, the basal layer, is going to be in direct contact with the basement membrane. So this type of epithelium is going to be an idea for areas that undergo a lot of mechanical stress, okay, where we are in need of structural support and protection. So that's stratified epithelium. So one cell layer thick, simple epithelium. Two or more, stratified. Then, of course, we always have an exception or something that has to draw our attention, and that's going to be the pseudostratified epithelium. Now, at first glance, when you look at this type of epithelium, it looks like it's going to be multi-layered. So we call it pseudo-stratified because pseudo is false, so it's falsely stratified. So it looks like it is, but that's not the case. Here's an important fact that you need to know for this type of epithelium. All the cells are going to contact the basement membrane, but not all of them are going to reach the apical surface. And it's because of that staggering appearance there, where you think, all right, that this type of epithelium is stratified in which it's not. All right, so the second tool that we're going to use to classify epithelial tissue is the shape. So we got a couple different cell shapes here. The first one is squamous. And the squamous is going to look like, to me, like a fried egg. It's flat, or it looks like a floor tile. And the nucleus is flat too. So that's the squamous cell, flat, wide, regular in shape. Cuboidal, just like the name says, is going to be like a cube. So it's as tall as it is wide, and the nucleus is directly in the center. It's nice and spherical looking. So that's cuboidal. Then we have columnar. Think of a column. All right, so it's taller than it is wide. And the nucleus is usually at the bottom portion of the cell, and it's oval, like an egg. And that's where we'll see that nucleus. And then the last type is the transformer epithelium. This type of epithelium changes shape, all right, more than meets the eye. So it depends on what is happening to that epithelium. You're going to see this type of epithelium in the urinary bladder. So when your urinary bladder is full of urine, because you're on a long drive and you're sitting in the back seat, and whoever you're driving with will not pull over, so you have to hold it while the bladder's filling up, and so it pushes that epithelium flat. So when there's a lot of stretch, this type of epithelium looks flat. And then after you go to the bathroom, when you've emptied your bladder, then this type of epithelium is going to be more rounded, all right, polygonal. We'll talk more about this here. So here you can see the different types of epithelium when we discuss how we classify it. Simple, stratified, based on the layers. Okay, look at the simple, all the cells make contact with the basement membrane. If you look at the stratified, only the bottom layer makes contact with the basement membrane. Now, an important aspect to understand, and I'm going to mention this to you because it's my job. When you look at this picture here, you look, the cells down here, the shape looks different than the cells up here. All right? Some would say that these are low columnar cells, all right, or more like a cuboidal shape. But up here, these look like they're squamous. And you'd be right on both accounts. So how do I name this type of epithelium? Do I call it stratified squamous cuboidal, stratified squamous columnar? No. This is how you name stratified epithelium. I repeat, this is how you name stratified epithelium. You name it after the cell type on the apical surface. So you look at the apical surface and you see that the cells here in the apical surface are squamous in shape, they're flattened. That's how you name that type of epithelium. So for this particular picture here, you would say, oh, that's stratified squamous epithelium, because the top layer, the cells are squamous. Keep that in mind. Never be confused by that. So here, when you look at this figure 5.3, all right, it breaks it down into the types of epithelium. All right, we break it down into the cell layer first, simple, and then stratified. And then we break it down into the subtypes, the specific types, like simple squamous, simple columnar. So if you look at this, it could be, I would say, look at this chart first, try to memorize this chart, and then it'll kind of give you a general understanding as we move through the different types of epithelium. I am not going to be going through each individual type in the review. That is going to be up to you to go through each individual type, because we would run out of time in the review and I wouldn't even get to the other 3 types of tissues here. All right, because that's basically just memorization, going through and learning. Flashcards are great. I would strongly consider that. The lab Quizlet that I'll send out is going to be a little bit helpful. That's going to be more for the lab though. Okay. But I would go through, there's some pictures in your book, all right, that have the different types of epithelium, and it talks about the function of the epithelium. And of course, again, I don't want you folks to think that, you know, I'm here just trying to advertise my YouTube channel. All right, it's not monetized. Okay, but there are more detailed lectures on there, okay, for chapter 5, if you want to listen to me talk about it more in detail. But this is a review. All right, so if you need a little bit more detail, you can use the book, but if you want to use the videos, just go into the YouTube channel there and just you'll see it. You can go into the playlists or just look for chapter 5, and I will go through that for you. Okay, so important slide here. We're talking about the function of epithelium. Simple epithelium is best suited for absorption, secretion, and diffusion, moving stuff across thin barriers. Stratified is great for physical protection, like the sole of your foot. You should have stratified epithelium there because of all of the abrasion that goes on when you're walking around. Okay, remember, our form is based on function. You heard that before, okay? Chapter 1, okay? So anatomy is going to be based on the physiology. So we were talking about epithelial tissue, so I cannot talk about glands. So keep in mind that when we're discussing glands, glands are going to be these tissues that make something and then secrete it. And so they can be either one single cell, right? And you have a single cell in the epithelium. It's called the goblet cell. And that's an exocrine gland, believe it or not. and its job is to make mucin. Now, mucin is great, but when we add water to it, it becomes even better because then it turns into mucus. And mucus is great for lubrication and it helps to protect. It also helps to a small degree to help neutralize some of the stomach acid that comes out from your stomach into the small intestine. So our glands can be either individual cells or multicellular organs that are made up of, obviously, epithelial tissue, and they're going to make stuff. And there's two types, endocrine and exocrine. Endocrine, very important, they lack ducts. So therefore, when they're making something, they have to secrete it into either the interstitial fluid and or blood. The interstitial fluid is all that fluid that sits outside the cell. So these cells will make stuff, they'll secrete it into the interstitial fluid, it'll find its way to the blood and then circulate throughout the body. Or if it's lucky enough, if it's close to a blood vessel, it'll secrete it directly into the blood vessel and then it'll circulate it throughout the body. So those are the endocrine glands. The exocrine glands, they do have ducts. But these type of glands once lived on the surface, like the Morlocks, if you're familiar with H.G. Wells' Time Machine, all right, society had evolved so much that a certain portion of society had to live underground and they could no longer live on the surface of the planet Earth far in the future. Well, the exocrine glands once lived in the epithelial tissue on the surface, but then they've invaginated or just dug deep down into our connective tissue that sits underneath the epithelial tissue. And so they're living there in the connective tissue, making stuff, and then they have a duct that connects from the gland itself all the way to the surface of the epithelial tissue. And that duct is going to be lined with, you guessed it, more epithelium, okay? So you're going to see exocrine glands made up of sweat glands. Okay, that's very helpful, especially in our skin when we're hot. Mammary glands are a modified version of our exocrine glands, and our salivary glands, which you get to talk more about in chapter 26 for digestion. Okay, so when we're talking about classification of these exocrine glands, and we talk about how we classify them based on their method of secretion, basically we're saying, hey, we classify these exocrine glands, glands with ducts, on their physiology, how they make what they make. So the merocrine glands, all right, there's three types, merocrine, apocrine, and holocrine. The merocrine glands, real simple like, they're going to make their secretions and then they're going to package them up into the vesicles. Now, we talked about this last week. We were talking about, all right, our endoplasmic reticulum and the Golgi apparatus, and you have transport vesicles and secretory vesicles, right? That's what we're talking about here. These merocrine glands are going to package their secretion up into these vesicles that we talked about. And they're going to release the contents of those vesicles through the process of exocytosis. Now, I hope that you've reviewed what that is, but in case you forgot, exocytosis is when a vesicle fuses with the plasma membrane and then it secretes or it expels the contents of that vesicle outside the cell. And that's exactly what happens here. These merocrine glands are going to do the same thing. So you see that this in some of the sweat glands, the salivary glands, and your tear or lacrimal gland, right, which is up on the lateral portion of your eye there, right? So these cells make the secretions, put them in a little envelope, a little transport vesicle, secretory vesicle, and they ship them to the plasma membrane, and then it releases the contents through exocytosis. So that's the merocrine gland. The apocrine gland, think of apo, all right, or apex, the top part of the cell. So in this situation, and for those of you that have ever seen a lava lamp, I was over at, I think it was Target yesterday, and I saw a lava lamp sitting there. And I was trying to get my daughter interested in it because she likes that kind of stuff, art stuff. And a lot of people don't remember, depending on how old you are, right, that lava lamps were pretty big a long time ago, several decades ago, 60s, 70s, 80s, whatnot. And so if you've ever watched a lava lamp, it's kind of neat to watch how the material inside, you'll see these kind of globs just pinch off from each other and then float to the top and then start over again. Well, that's similar to what the apocrine glands do. The top part of the cell, the apical membrane, is going to pinch off. And that's what becomes the secretion. So if you think about it, what's in the plasma membrane? Proteins and fat, right? Phospholipids, cholesterol, all that. Whatever's in the plasma membrane is going to be in our secretion. So the secretion for these type of glands is going to be a little bit thicker. Okay, so you're going to see this type of gland in our mammary and our ceruminous glands. And that's going to be found in your ears. The last type of gland is holocrine glands. I think of Holocaust. All right, when people talk about a nuclear holocaust, it's basically the destruction of Earth, all right, from nuclear war. Well, all right, holocrine glands, these cells just explode, not literally, all right, but they rupture. The cell just, I hate to say it, blows up, but it ruptures, and then the cell itself and everything inside becomes the secretion. So this type of secretion is going to be even thicker than the other two types of secretions because it's going to include the whole cell and its contents. So this type of cell, all right, will be found in your skin, the sebaceous glands, and it has an oily type of secretion to it. Sebaceous glands are associated with hair. So if you look at this picture here, you can see the different types of cells. All right, and glands. The first one, here's the merocrine. Here's the secretory portion of our cell. The cell itself is making its secretions, packaging it up into the vesicles, and it goes to the surface of the cell, all right, and then releases the secretions into the lumen here, and then they travel up to the duct and out onto the surface of the epithelium. Real simple. The apocrine gland, the top part of the cell, the apical surface of the cell, pinches off, okay, pinches off, and then that portion becomes the secretion. And then finally, the holocrine gland, here you see the whole gland just kind of, not the gland, excuse me, the cell itself ruptures, and it's all of it, the cell itself and the contents become the secretion, and it travels to the apical surface. All right, that's that for tissues. So we got one tissue out of the way, epithelium is out of the way. Now let's talk about connective tissue. Connective tissue, folks, this type of tissue is going to be the most diverse and abundantly distributed tissue in the body. It's found all over the place, all over the place. And so some of its functions are to support, protect, and even to hold organs in place, to bind those organs. So if you look here at all these examples, you find it in tendons and ligaments. Tendons hold muscle to bone, ligaments hold bone to bone, adipose tissue, cartilage, bone, and even blood. Yes, your blood is a type of connective tissue. And all of this connective tissue comes from a specialized type of connective tissue in which we call mesenchyme. It's an embryonic connective tissue. All right, so when we talk about connective tissue, all right, one of the characteristics when we talk about connective tissue is its vascularity. And basically it depends on, all right, the range of vascularity depends on the type of tissue that we're talking about. You can have tissue that has lots of blood vessels in it, that's very vascular, and then you can have tissue that has barely any blood vessels in it, and then you have tissue that has no blood vessels in it. We refer to that as avascular. And we'll see that with mature cartilage. Now notice it says mature cartilage. So when the cartilage is all grown up, all right, it's mature and it's avascular. But as the cartilage is developing, all right, when you're in the fetal stage, okay, you will have some blood vessels there. All right, so example of some very vascular connective tissue is areolar connective tissue. That is a type of loose connective tissue. An example of poorly vascularized or low vascularity is going to be, all right, dense regular connective tissue. That's going to be your tendons and ligaments is the dense regular. We'll go into some of this, all right? All right, some of the functions, okay? You're going to see that there is kind of like a crossover, some similar functions between epithelial tissue and connective tissue. So connective tissue serves as physical protection. Told you it helps to bind organs, so it's going to support, all right, the structural framework of our bodies. All right, it's going to hold organs and certain structures into place. Storage plays a big role when we're talking about, for example, adipose tissue. That's energy storage. All right, transport, fluid connective tissue. Our blood and our lymph fluid is going to transport, all right, things around. And then immune protection. Again, blood, connective tissue, our lymph connective tissue, some of our other connective tissues like reticular, all right, we'll have some immune protection going on. So when we're talking about our connective tissue classification, we try to break it down to you here. All right, so when we talk about connective tissue, there's 3 types. Okay, the first type is going to be our connective tissue proper, which has loose and dense connective tissue. Our second type is going to be supporting connective tissue, and that has both cartilage and bone. And then our third type is going to be fluid. So you want to know the 3 types. Just like I said, there's 4 types of tissue in the body. Well, you need to know the 3 types of connective tissue. All right, there's connective tissue proper, supporting connective tissue, and fluid connective tissue. And then there's subtypes. So we break down our connective tissue proper into loose and dense, and there's 3 subtypes for loose and 3 subtypes for dense. Supporting connective tissue, we break it down into cartilage and bone. There's 3 types of cartilage, 2 types of bone. And then finally, when we get to fluid connective tissue, okay, we've got 2 types. We've got blood and we've got the lymph. You should know those, just where they fall. Makes it a lot easier to understand. Give yourself a little bit of an understanding when it comes to the breakdown. It can be overwhelming. That's why I say use these figures to help you out, okay, to help you understand. Because I remember, not vaguely, I actually remember it very well when I took an in-depth histology course and the instructor was throwing all of this factual information to the class, and it's very overwhelming. A lot of times the words just seem meaningless, you know, but if you can find a way to organize it, and I feel like these figures do a wonderful job, then you can kind of give you an idea of what you're looking at here. Again, there's a lot of memorization involved, right? So this is just to help you to break it down a little bit. If you want a little bit more detail, again, there's other videos out there that can help you with that. Okay. Okay. So that is connective tissue. So our the third type of tissue is muscle. And you can see it written right here at the top. When you think of muscle, you think of movement. You think of movement. So the function of this tissue is for movement. Then we can get into the special details when it comes around to movement. But basically, when the cells of this type of tissue are stimulated, all right, they contract. And that contraction creates the movement that we're looking at. And so we'll deal with the different types here. So we'll see voluntary movement of body parts. Well, that's great. We need that if we want to type something out or put something into our mouth to eat. Okay. It also is helpful when that contraction causes movement, especially when we're talking about our heart, because our heart is a pump and it's going to move blood throughout your body. And then finally, we need to move things through some of our other systems, the digestive system, the cardiovascular system, the urinary tract system. All right. Well, muscle tissue helps with that. And there's three types: skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. Skeletal muscle is the only muscle type that is under voluntary control. Okay, so when you want to straighten your knee out, you do it. You think about it, you straighten your leg, and it's done. Okay, that is skeletal muscle. Cardiac muscle is not under voluntary control. It's under involuntary control. You cannot speed your heart rate from 55 beats a minute to 72 beats a minute, all right, just because you think about it. It doesn't work like that. Cardiac muscle is only found in one place. It's found in the myocardium, which is the wall of your heart. And then the last type of muscle tissue is smooth muscle tissue. Smooth muscle tissue, again, is an involuntary muscle tissue. You have no control over it. Okay, it is found throughout several different types, or excuse me, several different systems in your body. I like to talk about the digestive system, even the cardiovascular system. It's found in the walls of your blood vessels, but it also is found in the walls of the small intestine, large intestine, and it helps to move, all right, that digesting food through your digestive tract. So you'll learn more about that when you get into those specific chapters. The last type of tissue in the body is nervous tissue. Okay, so there's two types of cells that are involved with nervous tissue. All right, those are the neurons and the glial cells. But this type of tissue is found in the brain, spinal cord, and nerves. Easy. Those are the three places where you'll find this type of tissue. And the first two places, all right, make up what we call the central nervous system, or the CNS. All right, brain and spinal cord, those make up the central nervous system. So the first type of cell is the neuron. That's the rock star. That's the diva. That's the one that we'll spend a lot of time talking about this semester. All right. So its job is going to be to receive, transmit, and process action potentials, nerve signals. All right. So that's its job. Very important job. So because of that, all right, it has an even larger entourage. And that's what usually an entourage is. It's going to be larger than the actual star performer. You're going to have one star performer and like 50 people that take care of this person. All right. Well, that's what happens with the neurons. All right. Our glial cells outnumber the neurons, and they are the entourage. They're the support system. All right. It's important that you understand they do not transmit action potentials or nerve signals. They do not. Okay. But they do everything else. So they protect the neuron. They're going to bring nourishments, food, whatever to the neuron. All right. And they will support the neurons, keep them in place. All right. Not let them just kind of go wherever they want to go. All right. So the glial cells do a lot. We don't really talk about them too much. We will in a little bit. All right. But it's really going to be the neurons that we spend a lot of time on. All right. So when we talk about the neuron, just a couple things I want to quickly discuss here. We'll go into more detail when we get into chapter 12. All right, so you have your cell body, and I'm going to do my best to try to draw a somewhat decent neuron. So far, not too good. All right, so here is the big ball part area is the cell body. All right, and that's where you're going to have All right, the nucleus and the organelles like the ribosomes and the endoplasmic reticulum. All right, you're going to have those structures in the cell body, which is this big bulbous area here. And then you're going to have these nerve processes popping off. And so the smaller ones, those are called dendrites. And so they're either going to receive incoming nervous information or they're going to transmit that nervous information. Okay, so it's like an antenna that can receive signals and it can broadcast signals. And then you have one really big process that comes off of the cell body, and that's called the axon. And so that is going to transmit a nerve signal, all right, that this cell receives, all right, all the way down to the other end of the cell. And then it's either going to transmit that information to another neuron or to an effector organ, which is what I told you before in chapter 1. All right, an effector organ is either going to be a muscle or a gland. Okay, let's keep it simple, but impressive to know that these types of cells are the longest in the body. You can have one of these cells running the entire length of your arm. That's pretty cool. All right, so that's nervous tissue. So as we move, excuse me, as we move through, all right, now we've talked about all the tissues. So I want to graduate us up to the next level of organization, which is going to be our organs. All right, our organs, it's important that you know, now what we're going to do is we're going to take 2 or more tissue types. So you could have one tissue type that is secretory in nature and another tissue type which is absorptive in nature. We could put them together, all right, and we're going to stick them together, and these tissue types are going to work together like a team, all right? And so now we've just made an organ, okay? So it's basically it's 2 or more tissue types that are working together to perform specific, not simple functions, but complex functions. And in some of these situations, they have to work together or in concert. Like these, I use the stomach all the time as an example. Your skin too, because it is the largest organ in your body. It does have all 4 tissue types. The stomach does have all 4 tissue types too. So I like to use those examples quite a bit. All right, but we'll go with the stomach here. If you think about it, now we're going to run through all the 4 tissue types. The lining of your stomach, because remember, we use it to line organs, hollow organs, body cavities, line the outside of your body. Okay, the stomach lining is made up of epithelium. You're going to learn about all the different type of epithelial cells and their functions. Okay, some of those cells are there to make hydrochloric acid, for example. Some of those cells are there to make inactive proteins that are going to help to digest other proteins. Okay, but basically what they do is they secrete substances that are going to help with the digestion of whatever you eat or drink. All right, so here you can see this type of epithelium, we just checked off 2 of the functions, secretion, and it's also going to help with digestion, the chemical breakdown of things. All right, so here's the first type of tissue type. Okay, moving on to the second type of tissue, that's going to be connective tissue. So we'll see underneath the epithelium, we have a loose type of connective tissue, areolar, which is good because loose connective tissue is very vascular. We want to keep blood vessels close to epithelium that is involved in chemical digestion, because guess what? You know what follows chemical digestion? Absorption. If we're going to break stuff down, we want to absorb it, right? So we're going to stick some loose connective tissue close by with lots of blood vessels, because now we're going to absorb whatever it is we're breaking down into our bloodstream. Perfect, perfect. All right, so here we have our blood vessels and our nerves, which are going to be in this layer. And it's also going to start to help add the shape of our stomach. Our stomach looks like a big J-shaped structure. That's the best I could do. I'm sorry. It's not too bad though. Okay. So that connective tissue helps with the shape of that organ and helps with the supportive nature so it doesn't fall apart or collapse on us. All right, so there's the second type of tissue, connective tissue. All right, now we just need muscle and nervous tissue. Well, we just saw some nervous tissue there in our connective tissue layer, but our stomach has 3 layers of smooth muscle. And those 3 layers, the orientation of those muscle fibers go in different directions, all right, from any of the other layers. So each layer has its own individual direction that those muscle fibers move or are laid down and arranged. So it can help us to mix up the stomach contents there and to move the stomach contents out of the stomach and into the small intestine. So that's what we'll see. Think of the small intestine, or excuse me, the stomach like a cement mixer. It's going to churn and mix up the food and liquid, all right, that you have ingested with the secretions, all right, help to break some things down, and then we're going to move it into the small intestine and really get some good absorption going. All right, there's our third tissue, muscle, and now our fourth tissue, nervous tissue. Okay, and we have a lot of it there because the nerves tell the other tissues what to do. Remember, the nervous tissue is going to tell the effector organs, which are going to be muscles and glands, what to do. So it's going to regulate muscle contraction and relaxation, all right? And it's going to regulate gland secretion because eventually everything in your stomach will be done digesting, and now we have to shut the machinery down. So we have to turn it on when there's food present. We have to turn it off when there's nothing present. All right, so our nervous tissue plays a huge role in that. And so those are your 4 tissue types in the organs. Okay, so now think how far we've made it. We went with atoms and molecules, macromolecules, cell organelles, to cells as a whole, to tissues. We just talked about organs, all right? So what's left? Organ systems. And so now, after this chapter, we're going to start going into these individual organ systems, starting with the skin, and we're going to talk about the anatomy and physiology of those organ systems. But I just want to throw up this slide here about our body membranes, okay, because we are still talking about tissues on chapter 4 here, or 5, excuse me. All right, so there's 4 types of body membranes here, and I'll get into that in a second. But these body membranes are made up of epithelial tissue here. And then obviously underneath that epithelial tissue is where we'll find our connective tissue. And so we're going to see this lining the body cavities. We saw that with the serous membranes. We also saw those serous membranes covering some of the viscera. What is that? Those are the organs. All right, we'll see it in much more detail in chapter 6, but we're going to see that these body membranes cover the external surface of our body. So the 4 types are the mucous membrane, and you'll talk a little bit about that in this chapter, not this chapter, in this class, but more so in 211. But the mucous membranes are going to have a protective nature, and you're going to see the mucous membranes more so around the large respiratory passageways of your upper respiratory system. For example, your nasal cavity. All right, you've got a lot of mucous membranes there, parts of the pharynx, which are parts of your throat. All right, so we're going to see the mucous membrane, all right, in those locations because we need the mucus production for lubrication to offer us that protective function for that tissue. Serous, we talked about in quite some detail. All right, that's going to line the body cavities. We saw it with the parietal pleura, all right, the visceral pleura. The pericardium, that's a serous membrane. The peritoneum in your abdomen, all right, that's a serous membrane. Cutaneous, we're going to save that for chapter 6 because that's going to be the skin. And then finally, the synovial, that's going to be chapter 9 when we get to joints. And you're going to see that certain joints in your body have these capsules. And a joint is basically where 2 or more bones articulate or come together. And so some of these joints will have a capsule, and the inside lining of that capsule will have what's called the synovial membrane. And that synovial membrane has a lot of functions, one of which is to produce synovial fluid. So these joints will be fluid-filled joints. So again, you can see all these different locations where we'll find these body membranes throughout our body. We'll talk about these membranes throughout the course in 211. All right, I want to wrap up with just talking about some tissue modification here, some terms that you definitely should be familiar with because you're going to hear me mention it. Pretty much every chapter will usually finish up at the end of these system chapters talking about what happens to the tissue as you get older. Okay, so you need to know some of these terms. All right, the first term up there is hypertrophy. And it's very important that you know that hypertrophy has to do with an increase in the size only of existing cells of a tissue. So it's an increase of the size. Now, if we want to have an increase in the number of the cells, then we call that hyperplasia. So they both have to do with an increase, hence the beginning suffix there, hyper, okay? But one, hypertrophy has to do with the size increasing, hyperplasia has to do with the number increasing. So then you see this term here, atrophy. And a lot of you have heard that before, okay? And a lot of times if people have decreased activity levels, you'll hear of tissue atrophy or people that have been bedridden for a long time, all right, they start to lose muscle mass, okay? But this is, when we talk about atrophy, this is important. It's going to be a shrinking or a decrease in the cell number or the cell size, okay? Number or size. We have two different terms to determine, to describe the increase in size and to describe the increase in number. But when we talk about the decrease, we just have one term, that's atrophy. All right, and we'll get this through the normal aging process. I do believe after the age of your fourth decade in life, on average, okay, there's always exceptions to the rule. On average, you lose about 10% of your overall skeletal muscle mass. But there's ways to offset that, obviously exercising and whatnot. Okay, so normal aging, and we'll see disuse of an organ or tissue, like for example, the bedridden person. Another type of term to describe tissue modification is going to be metaplasia. So this is what we're going to see when a mature form of epithelium, all right, changes into a different form. So a lot of times it's for adaptive purposes. Smokers is a perfect example. All right, normally when we're talking about the trachea, you see this all the time. All right, the lining of our trachea is that pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. That pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium has goblet cells in it, produces mucin, which mixes with water, turns into mucus, adds lubrication. Wonderful. But for smokers, over time, that pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium goes away and it converts into non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. Completely different cell type. We went from columnar, right, taller than wide, to flat, squamous. You went from technically one cell layer to multiple cell layers. I mean, completely different. And it's an adaptive form to protect because smoking is carcinogenic, but obviously it's harmful. So the body has to do what it does to protect itself. Now, the interesting thing is it will revert back to that pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium if the person stops smoking. It says quickly. I mean, it won't be overnight, okay, but it will happen. There's been studies out there, and I'll tell you right now, the China study there, it's done by Dr. Colin Campbell, all right, from Cornell University. And I won't get into the details of the study, but they found out that 10 years after smoking, 10 years, now it's a long time, okay, but it's not forever, a person quits smoking, their likelihood of that person getting lung cancer has become the same as somebody that's never smoked. That's big, that's huge, huge. So for anybody out there that's quit smoking, you're like, oh, I've only quit for 5 years. Well, guess what? In another 5 years, your chances of getting lung cancer are the same as somebody that's never smoked. That's good news. You can say you got good news today on Tuesday afternoon at 12:04. All right, the last type, not the last type, excuse me, another type of tissue modification is dysplasia. Now, what we're seeing with dysplasia is abnormal tissue development, often referred to as precancerous. Okay, but it can go back to the normal form. All right, we see this quite often in females that have undergone a pap smear. They've gone in and they get a call from the doctor saying, okay, we found some irregular cells in the pap smear. We want to run it again because that will happen. That happens to almost every female. All right, sometimes it's just that you're not doing pap smears every month, okay? And so in case for some of you that don't know what a pap smear is, basically a specialist goes in and scrapes some of the cells off of the cervix, which is where the vagina and the uterus kind of meet up with one another. Okay, and so they scrape the cells off of there and they analyze them. And so in some cases you could have, all right, cervical dysplasia. And yes, there could be certain viruses, other types of certain pathogens which can cause that dysplasia to occur. All right, but that's why they monitor it. They do another one, and in a lot of cases, that follow-up pap smear comes back normal, and it's just because those cells happen to have a moment in which they became dysplastic, and then they reverted back to normal. And then there's the last type of tissue modification, neoplasia. Okay, neo being new. All right, this is where we're going to see tissue growth occurring at an uncontrollable rate. All right, and that tissue that is growing is an abnormal tissue. Cancer. All right, we hear of cancer. And so when we're talking about neoplastic tissue, we either describe it as benign or malignant. All right, benign is going to be localized. It's not spreading rampantly throughout the body. All right, it's not spread. All right, perfect example would be like a mole. All right, it's localized growth, benign. Now, malignant, that's the one that people have a tendency to get upset about and scared and worried, as they should be, okay? And malignant is going to be the type of neoplastic growth which can spread. And when it spreads, it can invade other tissues. And this is the big C word, okay, cancer. And depending on the growth and the rate of growth, and there's a lot of other characteristics, but it can interfere with normal cell function. When that happens, that's usually when folks, depending on what type of tissue we're talking about, where they become symptomatic, and then that's when they find out that they have cancer. And it can lead to death in some cases. Some of it can be treated. All right, and then there's a different type of tissue modification. All right, we have to talk about it, which is called necrosis. That's tissue death. All right, is usually going to be when that tissue has sustained significant damage, irreversible damage. All right, and it's no longer viable, all right, and it dies. And we'll see it, all right, usually if the inflammatory response, because that is the first reaction. When there's tissue damage, the inflammatory response is the first part of the recovery of that tissue damage, all right? So you'll see the inflammatory response occurring because of that tissue damage. Your body's trying to fix the problem, heal and whatnot. Gangrene is a great example of that. All right, when you get extreme cold weather going on, decreased blood flow to the extremities, especially the fingers or the nose or the ears or whatnot, and that blood supply is cut off, and therefore that tissue starts to die, and there becomes a problem. Now, this last slide here, yeah, that is the last slide. All right, this last slide here is going to be a slide that you're going to see, all right, throughout a lot of these chapters that we go through. So like I said, when we get to these chapters, we're going to talk about what happens to these tissues as we get older. All right, that's why it's important that you really understand what you're seeing here, because a lot of this is going to carry over to the other tissues, and it's going to make sense. And I'll draw frequent correlations to that. All right, so to promote normal function, if we were able to give our bodies the proper nutrition and take good care of ourselves, meaning try to avoid things that are not good for our health, like smoking, inactivity, poor food choices, and lifestyle choices, that will promote, all right, the proper functioning of these tissues. All right. But as we get older, sometimes it's not that easy. All right. And as you know, as we age, as we grow, even through puberty, from a toddler into early childhood, into, you know, adolescence and whatnot, as we grow, all right, a lot of these tissues have to be replaced, and they have to grow also. So when we're talking about the tissue, the aging process, all right, all during that time, your body is going to try to support, maintain, and replace any of the cells and any of the extracellular matrix that's associated with that tissue. And it's going to try to do that ongoing from the day that you're born to the day that you pass away. But as we get older, it becomes less efficient. Middle age is between the 4th and 5th decade of your life. I'm experiencing this now, all right? I don't recover from injuries as fast as I used to. If I pull a muscle in my back, it used to be when I was a teenager, I could get over that within a couple of days or a couple of weeks. Now it takes me, I feel like, a couple of months. And a lot of that has to do with what's going on at a cellular level. All right, so the actual cells themselves will change, the structure and the chemical composition of these tissues will change. And so this part here shows you all of what we'll see. Okay, your epithelial will thin. Well, let's apply that to real life. Your skin, older folks. If you notice on older folks in their 80s, 70s even, you might notice like Band-Aids like scattered on their forearms or on their legs or whatever. And that's because their skin starts to thin. The epithelia of the skin starts to thin. And so it makes them more prone to injury. All right, the connective tissue that sits in the deeper layer of the skin loses its pliability and resiliency. What does that mean? Your skin becomes less adaptive to stretching and recoiling. Part of that has to do with the fact that the levels of collagen, which is a protein fiber, it declines. You have less collagen, which is the protein fiber that offers a lot of strength and resiliency to the tissues that it's found in. You find a lot of it in your skin. All right, the bones become brittle. Yes, they do. All right, and we'll talk about that when we get into the actual formation of bone. Osteogenesis, okay? So when the bones become brittle, a lot of that has to do with decrease in collagen. Collagen is a big ingredient in bone. So if collagen declines, okay, our bones become more brittle. All right, and I mentioned this before, muscles will atrophy, okay? Nervous tissue also will start to atrophy. All right, now we can offset this by working on improving our diet, because a poor diet will make this whole process quicken. All right, and so it'll also, if we have issues with our circulation, like inactivity, okay, you always hear people get up, move around, get the blood pumping. Well, that's true. Your tissues need what's in the blood. Okay, that's the transport system for nutrients and wastes. So it helps to be moving around to increase that circulation. So we're going to see this, and I'll draw some correlations back to this slide here. And I'll say, remember when I told you about that aging tissue slide in chapter 5? All right, you can see why the bones become brittle, all right, and why this is occurring in this tissue. All right, so just go over this, make sure that you have a pretty decent understanding of it, and we go from there. Okay, so that concludes the review. Are there any questions here? Questions?